Support for this episode comes from Wix e-commerce, the complete e-commerce platforms that enables online stores all over the world to take ownership of their customer base and foster return customers with integrated CRM and loyalty tools. Give customers a reason to come back with loyalty programs which can increase your customers' lifetime value by up to 40%. Go to wix.com/ecommerce today and join over 700,000 active stores selling worldwide with Wix e-commerce. Hello and welcome to Decoder. I'm Nilay Patel, editor-in-chief of The Verge, and Decoder is my show about big ideas and other problems. And this episode is about a big idea that turned into a very big problem. Several years ago, I went to a splashy launch party for a new tech product, which is a pretty normal thing for tech companies to do. The party was at a hip warehouse space in Manhattan. There was cool lighting and a great DJ. There was free food. This company had pulled out all the stops. And the company had invited a ton of Instagram influencers and model types. So there were lots of beautiful young people there doing exactly what this company had hoped they'd do. They were taking photos and videos with the new product, talking about how cool it was, and posting it to social media. Now, if I was talking about a new smartphone or a camera or a laptop, this party would not have stuck out in my mind. Tech companies throw marketing events like this all the time. Influencers influence, the sky is blue, water's wet. This is how the world works. But this party was for a product called the Juul. That's Juul. It's a vape. And the Juul was, and still is, one of the most potent and effective nicotine delivery devices that's ever been created. Juul's big innovation was a nicotine formula that made its vape hit just like a cigarette. And the party kicked off a marketing blitz that seemed directly targeted towards teenagers on social media. After that, the Juul became a sensation, and a sensationally dramatic story. Yes, the marketing helped, but it also turns out nicotine is addictive as hell. A tech startup that had been founded in a Stanford design studio to disrupt the smoking industry had upended years of tobacco regulation in the United States, gotten a new generation of teenagers addicted to nicotine after years of declining teen smoking rates, and eventually found itself valued at $38 billion after a huge $12.8 billion investment from Altria. Altria used to be known as Philip Morris, and you probably know it by its most famous product, Marlboro cigarettes. Then it all fell apart. The lawsuits came, the Federal Trade Commission sued to unwind the deal, the valuations of both Juul and Altria collapsed, and Juul itself now faces being regulated entirely out of existence in the United States. How did this all happen? How did a startup that was founded to stop smoking end up in the pocket of Marlboro? How did Altria screw up this investment so badly? And how did a couple of Stanford kids figure out a better cigarette before the cigarette industry? To find out, I invited Lauren Eder on the show. Lauren is an investigative reporter at Bloomberg News and the author of a new book called The Devil's Playbook: Big Tobacco, Juul, and the Addiction of a New Generation. In the book, Lauren tells a story of how the tobacco industry went from hiding and lying about research that showed nicotine was addictive to being one of the most regulated industries in the country, and how that provided an opening for Juul to do things that tobacco companies could never get away with, like marketing to kids. The book is terrific, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Even if you don't care about nicotine and smoking, if you are a Decoder listener, you're going to recognize a lot of themes in this conversation. There's a big industry that's slow to adapt. There's a startup that's moving fast and breaking things. There's regulators around the world who don't really know what to do. And at the center of it all, there's a big question about our society's relationship with a product that might be bad for people, but that people still want. One note, just a couple days after we recorded this episode, the news broke that Juul has agreed to settle a lawsuit brought by the state of North Carolina that claimed the company's marketing practices caused a sharp rise in vaping among minors. Juul will pay a $40 million settlement, but it's also agreed to something else. It won't use anyone under the age of 35 in its marketing anymore. The party is officially over. Okay, Lauren Eder, here we go. Lauren Eder, you are an investigative reporter at Bloomberg News. and you're the author of The Devil's Playbook, Big Tobacco, Juul, and the Addiction of a New Generation. Welcome to Decoder.
Thank you for having me.
This is your first book, and I have to say, it is a very impressive first book. We covered the Juul story at The Verge as a tech story, but you've got a health story, a really complicated business and regulatory story here, and really the story of the tobacco industry and what it has become in this country. How did you start looking at Juul in this way, and how did you end up writing a book about it?
So I started writing about Juul after the outbreak of the lung injuries, this mysterious lung injury outbreak called EVALI. And I was just started writing about it from sort of a health perspective and trying to figure out what was going on, just like the rest of the nation, trying to figure out, is this related to Juul? Is this related to vaping? So I started writing some of those stories. And then I became interested in Juul as a business story. It was fascinating to me that a company that had found itself in the middle of this public health crisis was a Silicon Valley firm. So that's then how I started writing about Juul. So I wrote about that. And then as I embarked on a book, I was really endeavoring to tell the story of Juul. But I quickly realized it was impossible to tell the complete story of Juul without telling the story of the tobacco industry. Those two industries, the tobacco industry and Juul, were so intimately intertwined that it became evident to me that I needed to also write about the tobacco industry as well. So that's why I ended up with these two intertwined narratives.
Give people the really short version of the Juul story. This is a famous product. It was all over the news. Lots of people use Juul, but it has a really sharp rise and then a really sharp fall. Give people just the basic arc of that story.
Yeah, so most people know about Juul having launched in the summer of 2015 with this flashy nicotine device called Juul, and quickly taking off and taking over the entire industry and leading to a youth health crisis, youth usage. All the teenagers started using it, but actually the founders of Juul had been working on coming up with a healthier, less harmful alternative to the cigarette for years before Juul. Adam Bowen and James Monsees, two Stanford grad students, started working on, it's almost like a myth and a legend by now. A lot of people know this story. They met at Stanford in the design school. They were smoking cigarettes out back as they kind of pondered their next project. And they realized that it was idiotic to be smoking this burning stick, essentially shredded tobacco leaf rolled in paper, lit on fire, the same product that people had been using for more than a century. Here they are in the heart of Silicon Valley, where everything is ripe for innovation. And they realized, why hasn't the cigarette been innovated on? So they set out to innovate the cigarette. So as they embarked on that, they essentially found some of these old tobacco documents that had surfaced during the 1990s in the heat of the tobacco wars. And there were millions of documents that the tobacco companies had to hand over to make public as a result of litigation that had nearly buried them. So they tapped into that, had many, many iterations of their product before it became Juul, launches in 2015 ultimately, and just becomes the most popular e-cigarette on the market. They marketed it on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. They sent kind of traveling troops of these nicotine Juul marketers that handed out free samples at parties, on yachts, in the Hamptons, at raves. And it just became extremely popular. And as it became popular among the 20-year-olds, it soon became popular among the teenagers as well, middle school and high school students. So that was the moment, as it became just a runaway success, that it attracted the attention of public health regulators, of the FDA, of members of Congress. And it just became this huge issue where Scott Gottlieb, the then FDA commissioner, called it an epidemic of youth usage. So basically, the company finds itself under this incredible scrutiny from every angle. And at the same time, the traditional tobacco industry had been trying to also innovate on the cigarette, their declining business. The cigarette had been in decline for decades. Everybody agreed that the business was only going to continue to decline as people realized the adverse health effects of smoking, and it was not as cool to smoke cigarettes anymore. And so as big tobacco tries to innovate, they cannot out-innovate Silicon Valley. So at the end of the day, Altria, the maker of Marlboro cigarettes, decides to invest in Juul. In my book, I write, that was the moment the glass shattered for Juul. It's just attracted so much scrutiny because all of these years, the founders of Juul had been saying, we are the anti-cigarette. We're going to kill the cigarette. We're going to kill the tobacco industry. And suddenly they're in bed with the tobacco industry. So that really kind of put them on blast in a new way. They were under health regulator scrutiny. Their valuation, which once stood at $38 billion, was just tumbling quarter after quarter after quarter. And now there's been a huge reorganization in the company. They've brought in all these new executives, many from the tobacco industry, and they're essentially fighting for their survival right now. Juul, like every other e-cigarette maker, has submitted an application to the FDA. And now the FDA has to determine whether or not it's in the public health interest, essentially, to allow this product to continue to be marketed. So basically, we're all waiting. It's expected sometime this year for the FDA to decide whether or not it can be sold. If the FDA does not allow it to go forward, Juul has no product to sell. And if it does, I think Juul is well positioned to continue to grow and take over the market. So they're at a real inflection point right now.
And that is just a staggering rise and fall, right? It's two kids at Stanford looking at a product that they're using, doing the tech industry thing, asking this kind of hilarious bubble question of why hasn't anybody innovated this thing, realizing that actually lots of people have tried to innovate it, using some of that, and then all the way to now we're potentially facing regulatory doom.
Exactly.
The big innovation with Juul was not really the design or the pods, it was the nicotine formulation. How do they stumble on a nicotine formulation that hits like a cigarette? Because early vapes were really, really harsh.
This is like Juul's secret sauce, the nicotine salts, of course. So, right, early cigarettes, what they did was they essentially just took nicotine and they added some flavors to it. But the problem with just using nicotine is it's extremely harsh. It has a high pH level. It burns your throat. Early iterations of e-cigarettes, they essentially could only put in small amounts of nicotine so it wouldn't be so aversive to your lungs. The problem with that was that it didn't satisfy smokers because there wasn't enough nicotine in it. So they'd have to like puff and puff and puff on the thing, and it just wouldn't deliver the satisfaction. So that had been like the number one complaint by e-cigarette users. So Adam and James, they had done tons of research. They had delved into these tobacco archives, which contained all kinds of science about nicotine and about tobacco. The science of tobacco smoke and nicotine chemistry is extremely complicated and complex. And they were able to use basically some early research that showed if you modify the pH levels of tobacco smoke, you can deliver different kind of satisfaction levels, enjoyment levels, that type of thing. There's also a body of research that showed if you add organic acids to nicotine, it lowers the pH, but you can have higher levels of nicotine. You essentially, by adding the organic acids, you create a nicotine salt. And that essentially allows the pH to go lower, but you have a higher amount of nicotine. So what that does is that it enables you to inhale a large amount of nicotine without it burning your throat, without you starting to cough a lot. I should also point out that they hired tobacco industry scientists. They had them on speed dial. They would call them and they would ask about the different various organic acids and how that could modulate the pH. And they did all kinds of research, and they absolutely turned to tobacco industry executives and to the tobacco files, the archives, to help them solve the problem. They eventually did their own sort of experimentation in the dog patch in their offices there, where they were adding various organic acids to nicotine to see what the most satisfying ones were. And they ended up going to New Zealand, where they did their own tests on human subjects, including on Adam Bowen himself, to determine which organic acid in nicotine would give you the highest level of satisfaction, what would make your heart race the fastest, what would, when you take these little surveys, what would be the most satisfying one. So they did all kinds of just really organic research, and ended up settling on benzoic acid as the organic acid that was the most satisfying. What this enabled them to do was something that no other company had really done, which is devise a nicotine solution that had a high nicotine content, in this case 5%, which was ultimately marketed, but with a very low aversive component to it.
They picked benzoic acid. They have a patent. The patent lists like every other kind of acid you might want to use, down to citric acid. That prevents anyone else from doing this, right? Was that it? Was there another way around this problem? When I first saw that patent, I was like, oh, Juul's going to win. Now they can block everybody else from doing the thing that made their product better than everybody else.
Right. There's definitely been IP litigation over this, and there probably will be in the future. I just don't know how much Juul is going to be able to prevail on essentially owning chemistry. It's basic organic chemistry. So I don't know if it, on first glance, gives them the protection that you might think.
What struck me about your book is that you don't start with Juul at all. You start with Altria, which is the company that was known as Philip Morris. They made Marlboro. And you start with them in sort of the very late 90s, early 2000s. And it seems like what the entire cigarette industry was struggling with was, we're going to be a regulated industry now.
Yeah.
We'll be intertwined with government regulators. We'll be intertwined with health officials. We have to learn to be that kind of company where the government is kind of always up in our shit. Tell me about that, because that is, to me, there's a really big parallel, not in terms of the product, but in terms of the attitudinal shift that the entire tech industry is facing right now. Right. You and I are talking, and Congress is literally talking about antitrust bills simultaneously with our discussion today. But it just feels like that attitude shift created the opportunity for someone to not have the baggage and make the Juul. When if Philip Morris had invented the Juul, I mean, their business would have been secured in a different way, but they were just unable to.
Yes, that's exactly right. I started the book in the middle of a hurricane in Puerto Rico because I felt like it was emblematic of what the industry was going through, the tobacco industry. So back in 1998,
the book starts in the middle of a hurricane. You were not in the middle of a hurricane.
Right, correct. The book starts in the middle of a hurricane in Puerto Rico, and Philip Morris, the company now known as Altria, had gathered all of its corporate relations officials and executives and met here as kind of a retreat to talk about this huge moment in the industry where they had to basically admit that they had deceived the American people, that they had lied, that they had covered up all of this information and evidence about how deadly cigarette smoking was. And it had all come out into the public. The FDA commissioner, David Kessler at the time, had made it his mission to essentially go after the tobacco industry to bring it under its regulatory authority for the first time. State attorneys general were suing the tobacco industry and the tobacco companies for all of the public health effects and the costs related to treating smoking-related disease. Every week, there was a new headline about the misdeeds of the tobacco industry in the 90s. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And it really was kind of this important moment that I thought almost does parallel where we are today with Juul. They realized that they needed to have this permission to exist. And Juul essentially finds itself in the exact same position now, where they're kind of operating only if the FDA gives them permission to operate. They've realized that they created a youth usage crisis, or helped create it, and that they have to be incredibly careful about it. But the interesting thing is that when Juul launched, when Adam and James decided to innovate on the cigarette, They had none of that baggage that the tobacco industry had.
Right.
They had not been through the trenches, and they didn't approach the industry, this highly addictive product, nicotine. They didn't approach it with the necessary care in order to give their product a chance at surviving and asking permission from society. It's like the motto of Silicon Valley: move fast and break things, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And that's exactly the mentality that they embodied early on when they launched Juul. And it's also the mentality that allowed them to crush the market, to take over, and to basically flood the nation with Juul. So there are lots of similarities, lots of parallels between those two narratives.
Let me ask you about that, because the lack of baggage enabled them to make a product that the tobacco industry, I mean, and you go through this in detail in the book, that Philip Morris and the other big tobacco companies had been trying to invent Juul-like products for years. And because of their own regulatory problems and their own wacky international corporate structures, they weren't really able to do it well. The Juul team had none of that baggage. They were able to say what people want is nicotine, which the tobacco companies really could not say, given the regulatory scrutiny. And then they were able to deliver the nicotine salt formula in the pods of the Juul. I think a lot of people would tell you they're very happy using a Juul instead of smoking a cigarette. And that is probably a net good, although I have some questions about that too. The thing that I struggle with in this entire story is, well, it's better than smoking. And so, like, if the tobacco companies were not able to make this product, is it a net good thing that a startup that made a lot of mistakes along the way, didn't need to ask permission to exist, eventually did develop a product that is in some measurable way better than smoking?
You're hitting on the exact kind of controversy. And I think it's super important to talk about it in this way. First of all, it's partly a sociocultural question about nicotine and about why do people use nicotine? Why do they want to use nicotine? It provides pleasure. It does lots of great things. It provides pleasure. It can help you concentrate. It can help you focus. It can relax you. You know, there are all kinds of appealing aspects to nicotine. And I should point out, and this is also a very important point, it's not the nicotine in cigarettes that kill people, right? Nicotine has some adverse health effects, but largely not many. There are even some studies showing that nicotine can help in the treatment of serious disease, including Parkinson's. But what kills people when they smoke cigarette, the deadly aspect of a cigarette is the combustion, right? And this is kind of the thing that Adam and James focus on, is the combustion. It's the lighting on fire, the burning, inhaling these toxic chemicals that form these tar droplets that end up affecting the lining of your lungs and causing lung disease. So people smoke cigarettes because they want the nicotine. Why do people want nicotine? Well, they're addicted to it. I think the addiction element is sort of the most important and I think most interesting aspect to focus on, because what's so bad about nicotine? Well, you could potentially become a lifelong user of nicotine. So I think when we're talking about adult smokers, we know the reason they smoke is because of the nicotine. They want the nicotine fix. So why not give them a better alternative, a less harmful alternative that doesn't involve combustion? And that's the e-cigarette. So it sounds great. Well, I will point out that there haven't been, enough long-term clinical studies to show that there are zero adverse health effects. I think most people agree, and most studies show that there is a net benefit if you quit smoking and only use e-cigarettes. A lot of e-cigarette users also continue to smoke cigarettes. That's called dual use. In general, if you're an adult smoker and you just switch from cigarettes to Juul, for example, you're probably better off in the long run. The issue revolves around the kids, the teens, the youth who become attracted to the product and develop a lifetime nicotine addiction. If you can separate that controversy out from the adult usage issue, then the industry would be okay. I think that's the industry's plan, the e-cigarette industry's plan to survive, is to focus on the adult smoker. So back in the 1990s, at the height of the tobacco wars, almost 40% of teens smoked cigarettes. They were a tobacco user. By 2015, when Juul launched, it was down to like 10%. So it had been this huge public health coup. They had successfully gotten the youth tobacco use rate down to such a low percentage. So when Juul launched, and other e-cigarettes as well, suddenly you saw this rapid increase in the number of teenagers who were using e-cigarettes. Now, yes, better than a cigarette, but still adopting a nicotine habit. I mean, it's really two questions. It's, can you prevent youth from getting addicted to nicotine? Because I think most people agree that there's no real redeeming quality for a teenager to just start using nicotine. First of all, their brains are not fully developed. There's all kinds of science and studies showing that nicotine before your brain is developed can have all kinds of adverse health effects on brain development. You become more addicted because the pathways in your brain become solidified. And so you develop a greater addictive potential. It's really a question about who's the problem? Like, where does the problem lie? If we're talking about youth usage, then I think most people would agree that we don't want kids adopting a new nicotine habit. But if you're talking about current cigarette smokers, there's a pretty compelling case to say that a less harmful product that does not involve combustion, like an e-cigarette, can actually have a net benefit to society. So the problem for Juul was that they didn't set up the opportunity for themselves to initially go after the adult smokers. They ruined their opportunity early on by essentially committing the cardinal sin in America, which is contributing to a new youth nicotine epidemic. I think those two issues often get conflated and people start yelling over one another. They're kind of talking about different things, but unfortunately they're intertwined. Like, there's a moment in my book where I interview Mike Moore, the former famous attorney general who in the 1990s essentially took on the tobacco industry and was very gung-ho about that. And he described it to me in a way that I thought was really interesting. He said, companies have made billions of dollars getting people to suck something into their lungs. He says, I hate to say it so clear, but how could you possibly sell that? There's only one answer, and the answer is nicotine. It's never been about anything else but nicotine. Without it, there's nothing. There's no cigarettes, there's no Juul, there's none of it. And for me, that was a powerful conversation because it highlights and underscores just how dependent these industries are on addiction. One other thing that's important to point out is that 90% of adult smokers today began smoking before the age of 18. 99% began smoking before the age of 25. So the whole concept dating back to the 1990s was, if you can cut off the youth from nicotine addiction, you won't have a next generation of users. And from a public health standpoint, that's fantastic because then they wouldn't be smoking cigarettes. For the tobacco industry, that's a complete disaster because that means if we do not have the next generation of users, they do not have an industry that has a long life. So for me, the kind of controversial issue is less about whether adult smokers should be using an e-cigarette to quit smoking and more about the continuation of nicotine addiction that continues to addict new generations of users. So that's why I say it's almost a sociocultural question about, why do we want nicotine in society? Why is it good? Should we all just be hooked up to a nicotine drip? Would that be a better way? People like nicotine, but the bottom line is they're addicted to it.
A lot of the scrutiny around Juul happened because of the vaping-related illnesses and deaths that were happening in the Midwest. That led to a crisis of, is vaping bad? Which is yet another track from, is nicotine bad? Right? It's another way to conflate all of this. Is vaping bad? What was the result of all that? And how did Juul get caught up into it?
Initially, when the lung injury outbreak happened, everybody just assumed it was Juul, or at least it was vaping, because basically you had these kids showing up to hospitals who had chronic lung injury, like almost as if their lungs had been burned. They were on breathing machines and that type of thing. I mean, it was a very serious problem. And then you had adults, showing up at the emergency rooms, the same thing. They had these chronic lung injuries. I think immediately the media attention gravitated toward Juul because Juul was the most popular product on the market. Juul had been sort of singled out as the one causing the youth vaping epidemic. And now suddenly you have all these kids who vaped showing up at the emergency rooms. It was a huge PR crisis for Juul. And the CEO at the time had this kind of fateful interview where he went on national television and said, like, we just don't know. We don't know if vaping is safe. But as the FDA and the CDC began their investigation into the lung injuries, it took them months to figure out that it probably was linked to bootlegged THC products that were being vaped. So these were like pods that were laced with this product called vitamin E acetate, which is kind of a syrupy golden liquid that a lot of the bootlegged products were cut with in order to either make it more syrupy or in order to cut their product to make it last longer, to go farther. And so the CDC ultimately said it was most likely related to these products that contain this ingredient, vitamin E acetate. So by the time that the CDC got around to announcing that, their product had taken such a hit on the market. People were so spooked by vaping and by juuling that by the time that the CDC clarified things, it was kind of too late. There are all sorts of people who were furious at the CDC and the FDA for taking so long to come to that conclusion and for wrongly kind of singling out just vaping as the problem. However, I will point out that the CDC to this day continues to say that there's a small percentage of these lung injuries that were tied to nicotine-only products, so not the THC products. Then you heard stories of people who started going back to cigarettes because they were so spooked by the lung injuries, and people saying, oh my God, the FDA should have, or the CDC should have cleared this whole thing up earlier. It was a large misunderstanding, but it was also a catastrophe. And it was really bad for the industry. It was really bad for public health, but it also does underscore that there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on e-cigarettes to determine if they do cause any long-term health problems.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, I'll ask Lauren if she thinks of Juul as a tech company. If you work from home, the days can start to blend together, especially if you sit at one end of a webcam and your colleagues are far away. There's no shame if you haven't worn hard pants in months. If you're itching for team meetings with lunch provided, though, your employees might be feeling the same monotony. DoorDash, the company you know for food delivery, now has a way to help your team stay connected. DoorDash for Work makes complex orders simple. You can offer food benefits as an employee perk. It's called Dash Pass for Work. There are no delivery fees, and there'll be reduced service fees on eligible orders. Plus, you'll create a more competitive benefits package that will help attract and retain top talent. It's an incredible, remote-friendly work perk that people will appreciate. Take a closer look. Learn more by visiting work.doordash.com/decoder. That's work.doordash.com/decoder. Make work delicious. Support for this episode comes from Wix e-commerce, the industry-leading e-commerce platform with advanced online storefront features. Wix e-commerce is the complete solution for entrepreneurs, omni-channel retailers, and brands to launch, run, and scale their online stores successfully. With Wix e-commerce, you can reach new shoppers and sell in integrated sales channels like marketplaces and social media from a single dashboard. Running a Facebook Ads by Wix campaign can generate over 1,000% return on ad spend. Wix e-commerce also lets you take ownership of your customer base and build repeat sales with integrated CRM and loyalty tools. Give customers a reason to come back with loyalty programs, which can increase your customers' lifetime value by up to 40%. Go to wix.com/ecommerce today and join over 700,000 active stores selling worldwide with Wix e-commerce. We're back with Lauren Etter. The focus on nicotine is what enabled Juul to succeed, is a company that thought of itself as a tech company, as a disruptive company in those very heady days of 2015 when tech companies were going to disrupt everything. And they saw a big lumbering industry. They said they don't even understand their own product. They don't even understand what they're selling. We can make it sharper and better with a focus on design, with a focus on delivery, innovation, all the buzzwords. Is Juul a tech company? It seemed like a threshold question for us, right? We're a tech and science website. We realized we wanted to cover it. And we were like, well, it's a tech company. They act like a tech company. They talk like a tech company. Now, many years hence, we realize, oh, a bunch of those companies were not actually tech companies. WeWork was not a tech company. Was Juul a tech company?
I think Juul is a tech company, as much as they would like to now distance themselves from that. I mean, they sell hardware. There's software involved. They innovated. I do think that Juul is a tech company. They brought to bear the use of technology in order to innovate on a product that had zero technology in it. They disrupted. They raised venture capital. I do think they're a tech company.
It's a big debate on our team over whether they're a tech company. And I think for us, what qualifies something as a tech company is whether you have the margins of a tech company, right? Whether you make a piece of software and sell it over and over again. Juul has a very mechanical product. They have to manufacture the liquid in the pods. They have to manufacture the pods. And they had a lot of, oh, crap, we make a hardware product with liquid in it problems along the way. And that ran right into some very strange regulatory moments that you kind of unpack in the book. I'm curious if you can tell that story and kind of help me understand how they got through it.
So essentially, their technology, it's a battery, has a little heating element in it. The battery actually heats the pod. You insert the pod, and when you suck on it, it triggers the battery to heat up and create the vapor. There's also some electronics inside. And what they found early on, what most e-cigarette companies found, was that the liquid contained in the pod, the nicotine liquid, would leak down into the guts of the Juul device. It was a really pernicious problem. When you're a startup and you're scrappy and you're trying to gain market share, having these kind of glitches in the functioning of your technology is very, very problematic. What Juul set out to do was to fix the problem. It wasn't an easy fix for a variety of reasons. They couldn't figure out for the life of them why the pods were leaking, how to solve for that issue. They would take the pods on airplanes and over mountain passes in order to figure out, was it the altitude that was causing them to leak? Was there some other design glitch in the manufacturing process that was causing them to leak? But it was a huge problem that they had to solve for internally. The problem for Juul was, at the time, the FDA was cracking down on the industry. And they came out with this law that said for the e-cigarette companies that you could continue selling your product, but you couldn't make any modifications to them. The FDA was essentially trying to freeze the market, so there would be no new entrants and they could kind of wrap their arms around this like unwieldy market. So they said, if you have your product on the market, we're not going to enforce against you. You can keep selling it until you file this PMTA and get the thumbs up or thumbs down from the FDA. But in the meantime, you're not allowed to make any changes to your product. I think this is a moment where Juul really embodied the sort of Silicon Valley ideal of move fast and break things, ask for forgiveness, not permission. They actually ended up changing their device. There's a lot of argument around whether or not the change that they made to the device rose to the technical definition of a modification and whether or not that was a breach of the FDA's rule. But the fact of the matter is that they did modify their device after this, what they called the deeming date of August 8th, 2016, at a time when you were not supposed to do it. But Juul was at this moment where they were like, if we don't fix this, we're screwed and we're going to just get crushed by competitors. But if we do fix it, the FDA will probably never know and they'll never ask us about it. And it was a tiny enough modification. They changed the structure of the pod a little bit. On the motherboard, they changed some of the way that the product actually worked. They put a new sensor inside of it that would withstand leakage better, that wouldn't cause it to brick, that type of thing. I thought that was a really interesting moment for Juul because the tobacco companies might not have done that, even though they face the same risk. And in fact, there was a very heated debate inside Altria because they had a similar kind of leaking issue. And they debated for a long time whether or not it would rise to a modification and be in breach of the FDA's rules.
While that's all happening, Altria is freaking out that Juul exists, that it's going to steal their market share and destroy their business. They're paying a lot of attention to Juul, and they're the ones who find the change before the government finds the change. Why didn't they just copy the Juul? When I think about big tech companies now, they just relentlessly clone their smaller competitors all of the time. Why didn't Altria, as it's looking at the Juul so closely, they're buying them, they realize that they've made this change. They've already effectively reverse engineered it to understand what's going on. Why didn't they just copy the Juul?
It was a question I just kept asking over and over again. How could Altria have been so behind or so clueless? Why did exactly your question? I would ask that. And the answer is sort of multifaceted. Altria was number one, they were late to the game. When they introduced their very first e-cigarette product, they called them the Cigalikes. It was one of those that looked like a cigarette and it had e-liquid inside, but it was really trying to approximate a cigarette. It was cylindrical. It was wrapped even in this paper material. It was white. It had a glowing tip. So when you sucked on it, it looked like a cigarette. That was the first product that they put out on the market. That was around 2013, 2014. Then Juul hits the market in 2015. And yeah, they start doing the teardowns of Juul, just like they do with any other product, figuring out what is this thing? It looks like no other product on the market. We've never seen anything like this before. And they honestly debated for so long whether or not it was going to be a threat to their product and to their industry. And they had different management before Howard Willard took over and ended up doing the deal with Juul. But at the time, the management was very circumspect about the long-term viability of the e-cigarette market. They thought that regulators were not going to tolerate another nicotine product on the market without going through lots and lots of regulatory hurdles. They believed that this market would not last for long and that they didn't really need to, pour tons and tons of money into it in order to innovate. They already had sort of gone down that road, but a little bit reluctantly. Altria had put their kind of future plan before Juul came around was that their harm reduction play was going to be in smokeless tobacco and snus. That's what they were thinking. They were thinking of going in the direction of this, people are going to use nicotine, but they're going to do it in a pouch. And so when Juul hit the market, they were just kind of already behind the ball, even though they had done decades and decades of research. And by the time they realized it was actually a threat to them, the FDA had implemented this rule, the deeming rule, in August of 2016. And all the companies were forbidden from putting any new product on the market. So literally, Altria, they dragged their feet for so long, kind of underestimated the trajectory of the market. And by the time that they realized, oh shit, Juul is actually this, crazy product that's just eating our market share, they couldn't do anything about it. They could not introduce a new product to the market.
So the FDA has this deeming rule. At the same time, Altria knows that maybe it could kill Juul by going after the regulators. It seems like the cigarette companies wanted to be seen as the responsible adults, even though they sell cigarettes. And they wanted to cast the tech companies, the vape companies, as being reckless upstarts. At some point, the Trump administration gets involved. The whole thing becomes very politicized. And Altria ends up making this gigantic investment in Juul. How did that all come about?
So in this kind of bout of desperation, when Altria is realizing that Juul is an actual threat, they actually start scouring the globe for products that they could just simply buy that had been on the market prior to August of 2016 and put them on the market. They ended up finding this Chinese manufacturer that had this product that they could prove had been on the market prior to 2016. So they did introduce this, what they deemed to be their competitor to Juul, which was Mark 10 Elite. It looked kind of similar to Juul. It had like the battery and it had the little pods. This was Altria's very first pod product. And they didn't introduce it until like 2000. I'm forgetting the date right now. I think it might have been 2018. But the problem with that product is that it was absolutely terrible. It didn't have the nicotine salts like Juul. It was ugly. It didn't have the form factor. It didn't have the Silicon Valley je ne sais quoi. And people didn't really like it. But Altria tried like flooding the market with that product. You know, they would figure out, oh, where's Juul doing really well in sales? Let's go there and just like cut the price of their product to have this like price war. And they really did put up a fight for a while. And they realized that there was no hope, essentially. Mark 10 Elite was a terrible product. Everybody knew it. It was almost like an internal joke where they were just like, this is pathetic that we're trying to compete with Juul when they have like 60, 70% of the market and our product isn't even close to what they have. And all along, once Howard Willard became the CEO of Altria, he was of the mindset different than his predecessor that we should consider doing a deal with Juul. Like, let's try to buy Juul, you know, instead of competing, let's just try to buy our biggest competitor and make them part of our brand portfolio. And that had been a strategy that Altria had used for years, like in the smokeless market, when they couldn't figure out how to make a brand that was competing with Copenhagen, they just went out and bought it. This was sort of an old playbook for the tobacco industry. And so they started thinking, well, let's buy Juul. They engaged in negotiations over a very long period of time, starting in 2017. And there was all this back and forth. Altria initially wanted to just buy Juul outright. And Juul immediately was like, we have no interest in selling outright. We want to retain control of the company. And so there are all these negotiations going back and forth. And they ultimately decided to invest $12.8 billion into Juul for a 35% share at a time when the company was valued at $38 billion. I should point out this entire transaction, the Federal Trade Commission has sued. What happened was Altria, weeks before the deal was announced in December 2018, they just took Mark 10 off the market, their elite product. They told the FDA, we're so concerned about the youth usage issue that we want to be a team player. We want to show you how responsible we are and how concerned we are for public health. We don't want kids using these pod products. So we're going to be responsible and we're going to remove Mark 10 from the market. That's what they told Scott Gottlieb. Well, less than a month later, there was this announcement that Altria had purchased a 35% stake in the biggest pod product on the market that had been seen as the biggest contributor to the youth usage issue. Scott Gottlieb was furious. The FDA felt like this was entirely duplicitous and was basically just said that they were playing the FDA like a fiddle. So that all happened. Then months later, the FTC sued to unwind the deal between Altria and Juul. They alleged that it was anti-competitive because Altria took its Mark 10 product off the market and essentially colluded in order to gain a larger market share. So literally the trial is going on.
Doesn't that kind of make no sense though? You have a crap product. You know you're not going to succeed. The nicotine salts are patented. You can't go after them. You shut it down to buy the small company that makes a good product. Like, that's just business 101. Like, what is the actual collusion there?
Right. The idea is that Altria could have competed in the market, that they had intended to compete. And had there been another large player with deep pockets in the market like Altria, they could have fostered a more competitive market. They claim that there was a quid pro quo, that Altria took its Mark 10 off the market in order to do the deal with Juul. And that was anti-competitive. That resulted in monopolistic behavior. So, of course, Altria is arguing exactly what you're saying right now. They are currently before the FTC. All of their executives are being interviewed. They're testifying. And that's exactly their argument, that this was a product that was so bad. It had no future. It was the shittiest product on the market. We couldn't, I mean, it's a hilarious argument for a big tobacco company to be making. Essentially, like, we were terrible at innovation. Our product was the worst and we sucked. And so we had to basically take the product off the market. It's kind of a complicated issue. Like I said, the FTC will decide and the deal could be unwound, and that would be something for sure.
The structure of the deal is really strange, right? Like, a lot of Juul employees just got huge amounts of cash and walked, which is not usually how these kinds of deals work. You get stock, you have a vesting period. There's all this stuff that makes you stay after an acquisition, but it feels like a lot of Juul employees and investors got huge checks and bounced.
Yes, it was a highly unusual deal. So essentially, the $12.8 billion that Altria paid for its stake was structured as a special dividend. What that meant was that none of the existing shareholders had to sell their stock. They essentially just got a check for $12.8 billion. Some of that was distributed to employees. $1 billion in bonuses paid out to employees, depending on their tenure. Some of them got hundreds of thousands of dollars just as a special bonus. Others got more than $1 million. Of course, the largest beneficiaries of that deal were the board members and the founders. So the single largest shareholder at the time, Riaz Villani, he made around $2.6 billion, just like a windfall. Nick Pritzker, the Hyatt billionaire, he made $1.7 billion. Bowen and Monsees each got about $650 million apiece. It was highly unusual. Oftentimes when you bring in that type of investment or that type of capital, you'll use it, either to pay down debt or to go to your company's operations. This was just a chunk of money that it was just divided up among them, and they got that. So almost none of it went back into the company. In fact, none of it went back into the company. So yeah, that was a sweet deal for Juul.
It feels like Juul had so much leverage because it had a product people liked better than cigarettes that it was able to just extract for itself a cash out. They basically sold the problem to Altria.
Yeah, and that's the most amazing thing about this deal. The fact that Altria paid that amount of money is just reckless, in my opinion. It's like everybody knew the company was, coming under this regulatory scrutiny, that they had this lung issue that they had been entangled in, that they had been fingered as the single largest contributor to the youth epidemic. I mean, there were so many risks in investing in this company, but it was almost a byproduct of just sheer momentum and desperation that ended up in this $12.8 billion payout. Altria basically had its back up against the wall. Juul had them over a barrel. They were so desperate to basically have this product that they could sell that would, actually give them a foothold in the e-cigarette market, that they paid this huge sum of money. I think it was a terrible deal. I think everybody agrees it was a terrible deal, except for Bowen, Monsees, Pritzker, Villani. They made out pretty well.
Let's take one more quick break, and when we come back, Lauren will tell me where Juul stands now with the FDA and what the FDA's decision could mean for Juul's survival.
Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. According to studies, less than 13% of all inventors who hold a U.S. patent are women. Black and Hispanic college graduates patent at half the rate of their white counterparts. But we can fix that by increasing participation in innovation and patenting by underrepresented groups. It would quadruple the number of American inventors and increase annual GDP by almost $1 trillion. Invent Together is a coalition of organizations, companies, universities, and concerned citizens committed to ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to invent and patent. Because the more diverse the American patent system gets, the stronger and more successful our nation will become. What can you do to help diverse inventors patent and unleash economic opportunity? Find out at inventtogether.org. Learn more and take action today.
What's your game plan for your investment portfolio in 2021? Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned veteran of diversification, odds are that you're missing something: private real estate. Specifically, private real estate vetted by Fundrise. Stocks, bonds, and mutual funds are all important, but private real estate through Fundrise can really help fill in the gaps. In fact, studies have shown that those with private real estate in their portfolio get a better risk-adjusted return with more annual income and lower volatility. So what does Fundrise do? They give you, from an amateur trader to an ace market mover, access to a diversified portfolio of private real estate. And Fundrise knows every portfolio is different. Their platform can help you add stable cash flow with dividends, or you can stick around for some long-term growth through appreciation. Plus, with their easy-to-use platform, it's accessible to everyone. Their crew of top-grade real estate pros vet and actively manage all their real estate projects, and you can keep an eye on your portfolio thanks to their website, which shows data on properties across the country as they're acquired, improved, and operated via dynamic asset updates. Meet your 2021 investing goals with help from Fundrise. See for yourself how 150,000 investors have built a better portfolio with private real estate. It takes just a few minutes to get started. Go to fundrise.com/decoder today. That's fundrise.com/decoder. Once again, that's fundrise.com/decoder. It feels like a really strange moment for the FDA, for public health officials to be talking about regulating various health and tech companies. Obviously, we came through the pandemic. The FDA was politicized very deeply. Public health was politicized. There's a lot of lack of trust in institutions. Smoking rates rose during the pandemic, which is one of the odder effects of a respiratory illness, I think. What happens next? How does this all come together?
It's actually fascinating. The FDA is essentially trying to carry out this long-term plan that began under Scott Gottlieb, but that had actually been talked about for decades, which is the end game. They call it the tobacco end game. What that means is the FDA has decided that there's a huge potential public health benefit in getting people off smoking cigarettes onto potentially less harmful products like Juul. It's so strange because the FDA had been going after Juul for so long. And, there'd been this whole explosion of the youth issue and how that just kind of subsumed the agency. And now, as they talk about this plan where they're going to reduce nicotine, if it all goes through, but this is a plan that the FDA has, and it's going to go through the regulatory process. It's going to take years. But the plan is that they're going to reduce nicotine in combustible cigarettes to non-addictive levels. The idea being that, again, if there's no nicotine or minimally addictive amounts of nicotine in cigarettes, people aren't going to use them. So they can essentially get rid of the cigarette. That's the FDA's strategy, is to get rid of smoking. As part of that strategy, they want to be able to provide a clean nicotine alternative for cigarette smokers. And that's to enable them to transition off of the non-addictive cigarettes. So if there's a category of people that they can't get the nicotine from their cigarettes, but they still very much want it, that the FDA would like to have sort of a suite of products available to the public that will give them their nicotine fix without being as deadly as a cigarette. So this has been an issue that Mitch Zeller, who's the head of the Center for Tobacco Products, has been working on for decades. He's written all kinds of articles and studies about it, literally dating back to the 1990s. And this whole idea of this harm reduction plan that, if you can just provide people with a less harmful alternative to cigarettes, then you could save a lot of lives. And it's very much like what Adam and James talked about, the Juul co-founders, early on. If the FDA approves Juul or authorizes Juul to continue to be marketed, it could actually position Juul to be like the product that smokers turn to because they no longer have their nicotine in the cigarettes and they're searching for something else. I mean, sure, there are other products on the market that compete with Juul, but I think a lot of people agree that Juul remains the most popular and it's one of the most effective kind of nicotine delivery mechanisms out there on the market. So it's just fascinating to me that the FDA, in sort of carrying forward with this nicotine reduction plan, could actually potentially be kind of setting up Juul for a resurgence, another life, act two, however you want to say that.
I've noticed there's a lot more nicotine replacement or nicotine delivery products in the market lately. Just at my local CVS, the shelf behind the counter of nicotine stuff has gotten bigger. There's more flavors. There's new kinds of lozenges. There's more exciting kinds of gum. It seems like they're becoming consumer products in a way that, I don't know, Nicorette never thought of itself as a consumer product. Is that a shift that was precipitated by Juul, or is that a new market opportunity created by the FDA?
I think there's this realization that this is a huge market. The market for nicotine products is like $800 billion globally. I mean, it's a massive market, and that includes like lozenges, patches, all of that, including e-cigarettes and stuff like that. But it's a huge market. And I think that this gets back to what we were talking about, the socio kind of cultural question about like nicotine use in America. I think businesses realize that this is a market that is not going away. Even if people aren't getting nicotine from their cigarettes, they're going to continue looking for nicotine in other places, whether it's through Juul, whether it's through a lozenge, whether it's through a patch, all of that. I think that we're going to be a nation of nicotine users and nicotine addicts. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And I think businesses have recognized that there's an opportunity. Certainly the advent of Juul thrust that market forward with maybe greater velocity, seeing just how much money can be made and seeing how popular it is, that type of thing. But certainly, as the FDA moves forward in reducing nicotine levels in cigarettes, that market is only going to continue to grow. I think that the industry is transforming from, the tobacco industry to the nicotine industry. And so I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in the nicotine industry. There's going to be more nicotine products.
Do you think the FDA has changed its approach? I mean, we think about the FDA at The Verge as regulating health tech, right? That Apple's going to put another sensor on your watch. They're going to make some claims about what it can do. The FDA should probably step in and verify those claims or prevent Apple from making those claims or whatever it is. On the flip side, there is the pandemic. Like it's unavoidable that a bunch of public health mandates got deeply politicized. And a lot of people in America are just like, don't tell me what to do. I'm an adult. I'm going to take whatever risks I want to take, and that will be the end of it. Get out of my hair. And those things seem like a collision course, and the nexus of that collision is nicotine products.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is one of the most politicized products in the world. I mean, you have the tobacco industry right now, as we speak, going to great lengths to try to influence the FDA to re-educate Americans about nicotine. Altria has told the FDA that they believe that some of the funding that they've been using on anti-vaping campaigns should also be used on teaching Americans that nicotine isn't unhealthy. And of course, you have the anti-vaping people, the youth tobacco prevention people who they want to see less of these products on the market because they continue to pose a threat to youth. So the FDA is under a huge amount of pressure right now. I think the FDA is in an impossible position. If they do not approve Juul, I think there's going to be lawsuits all around. It would look terrible for the FDA to single-handedly put an American company out of business, which is essentially what would happen if they don't grant this, regulatory authorization. And at the same time, they would be removing from the market the exact type of product that the FDA is in a way endorsing or facilitating when they say that we're going to take nicotine levels down and we want Americans to use a less harmful alternative. So it's a very complicated, controversial issue that has so many different facets to it that there's absolutely all kinds of political pressure and lobbying going on right now.
Reading your book, looking at the history of the research and how it's politicized, it seems like the cigarette companies just created a lot of noise in the research, right? They paid for a lot of studies. They said, we can never really know this stuff. It feels like there are echoes of it now where you can pick a study and it says what you want it to say. Is that a strategy that Juul is using now? Is that a strategy you see other companies using? It seems like that the tobacco wars, as you called them, became the focal point for what we can actually twist science to say whatever we want it to say, or at least create confusion.
Yeah. And I think that the way that the tobacco industry just obfuscated and lied and covered up scientific research, and at the same time paid scientists to generate studies that would support their conclusion. One of the reporters back in the 1990s called it the largest misinformation campaign in American business history. There was an extraordinary amount of lying and deceit by these tobacco companies. And I do think that that's causing a huge challenge for Juul right now. One, because anything they put out is going to be immediately doubted as just being, another kind of study that's been bought and paid for by the tobacco industry. It's making it very hard for the company to come up with any sort of credible science that people are actually going to, take hook, line, and sinker. I mean, there have been some issues recently where there was a public health journal where Juul essentially paid for the entire journal. And there was a series of studies in it. And there was all these disclaimers saying that these were people who worked at Juul, scientists at Juul, consultants who were hired by Juul. Literally the entire journal was articles written by people paid for or employed by Juul. And it caused a huge kind of controversy in the public health community and among researchers and scientists who are saying, well, this is essentially happening again. Now, Juul will say that, these were legitimate studies that they did that, deserve to be in this public health journal. But to me, what I found most fascinating is just the reaction to that, where immediately people jumped on that and said, this is exactly like tobacco 2.0. They're using the same tactics. They're, buying health journals and they're engaging in those same types of tactics.
A lot of the focus of the controversy, a lot of focus in your book is that Juul's marketing to teenagers, to influencers, to social media created the crisis for itself. That they had an initial marketing plan and they hired a flashier marketing guy and he was like, we're going all in, New York City cool, billboards with models, the whole deal. And that created the problem. I actually went to the Juul launch party that you describe in a warehouse full of influencers and beautiful people taking selfies. And the whole thing was literally, it was full of Juul vape. It was an incredible party. And I walked out with a Juul and then I was immediately addicted to a Juul. It was great. I hope my mom doesn't listen to this. I've since quit.
Good for you.
Is the problem that it was just too cool? It's such a weird aspect of this controversy that one of the things that set Juul on the path of destruction was that it was perceived as cool, which is what every business person wants their product to be perceived as. Is the heart of the problem that they hired the wrong marketing guy and they chased cool instead of, being perceived as medicine or a back brace or something that will just never be as cool?
Absolutely. I think that is and was their biggest misstep. I think had they treated the product with the requisite care that an addictive product should have, then they would have been better off. Instead, they hired a marketing staff whose sole focus was making this product as flashy and attractive as possible. They treated it as a gadget, as, the next generation, iPhone, and that it was a fashion accessory. They gave it to models on runways at the New York Fashion Show. So literally it was a fashion accessory and they treated it like that. And, the way that the early ads essentially had pictures of these young, beautiful people